As our monetary mediums become more complicated and abstract, I think it's going to do two things. First of all, it's going to create a widening class divide, so concentration of wealth among the productive people. And it's also going to allow us to be more productive as a society as a whole. And I'm going to go into why I think those things are going to happen in a second here. But let's just take a look at what I mean. What does it mean that the monetary mediums are becoming more complex and abstract? Well, if you look back in time, they used to be very tangible, okay? You look at mediums of exchange like salt or like cattle, and they don't actually rely on other people accepting them to be valuable because a cow makes milk, salt makes your food taste better. It keeps you healthy to some extent, you know. Now everyone's worried about salt, but we forget how important it is for your diet, you know. That a lot of animals have a hard time getting enough salt in their diet. Anyway, so right, it's very tangible. Other things like seashells, like gold, like beads, it's very tangible because they're beautiful and they can improve the experience of your life as a whole by adding beauty to it. Doesn't matter if other people accept it as a medium of exchange. It's very tangible, it's very concrete. The value in part comes from just what it does in and of itself. Okay. Now you look at modern society, how things have gotten progressively more complicated. Okay. You take gold backed currencies so that they're easier to transport across space. You'll give this dollar bill, it will be accepted by someone else, it's backed by gold, and then it can theoretically be exchanged for gold, and that keeps it in check to some extent. Of course, there's problems, there's fractional reserve banking, there's people leeching off the money supply. Like I said, there's going to be corruption when there's power and when there's large groups of people, but that's another layer of abstraction, right? You take the gold, it's more tangible. Now you have the dollar, it's less tangible. You would have to exchange it for gold. A lot of the value of that comes from its purchasing power. Okay. And that continues as we go off the gold standard with Nixon. And now that it's not backed by anything except for its purchasing power. You know, it's redeemable for goods and services with other people who accept it. And they accept it because they believe it will be accepted by other people to in exchange for goods and services. Okay. These types of abstractions create more and more corruption in the fiat system. There's fractional reserve banking, that's problematic. Now when there's no tie to gold, there's even higher levels of inflation, which is arguably stealing, you know, from everyone that's holding those assets. What does this do? Well, I'm not going to make a full point and be like, yes, this is the capitalists and they're evil and corrupt and leeching off, you know, the hardworking people. No, that's not what I'm saying here. I'm just saying that it requires a higher level of understanding to properly manage your money. If you're just holding on to gold bars, there's not a lot of concern whether they're going to be manipulated or you don't have to protect your savings with knowledge to the same extent that you do in an economy where there's pretty extreme inflation and there's a lot of lies surrounding that inflation with the CPI and all of these things, right? You know, everyone wants to hide how much the money supply is increasing. And of course, there's other types of inflation. There's cost push inflation, okay? You know, there's shortages of supplies. So, supply side inflation. There's a lot of different things, and monetary inflation is only one component of it. So, of course, in the past, you want to maybe be aware of these things to protect your resources, but it's more of like an added bonus. At this point in time, if you want to preserve money, you really need to look into some historical things and some current things. You know, look at the evolution of the Federal Reserve. That didn't used to even exist. You used to have to buy bonds directly from the government, and in a sense, you could vote with your wallet, you know. And then it becomes even more complex when you look at Bitcoin. I mean, it's simpler in some ways, but it's more complex in other ways because you have to have some understanding of technology and computers to understand how the system works as a whole, which might be off-putting for a lot of people. You know, it's not as digestible as something like gold is. Or you see what I'm saying here though is over time it's becoming more abstract, requiring more knowledge, and that acquisition of knowledge is a barrier to entry that a lot of people don't take that step, you know, to enter. And then they're more easily manipulated. They don't understand how to save, you know. Maybe they buy bonds and they're like, well, you know, it's keeping up with the CPI, so it should be fine, right? And these sorts of things contribute to a widening class divide. The other thing, too, I want to point out is the fact that it's easier to be productive, but also harder to be productive. Like, there's a lot of access to entertainment and to enjoyable things now for pretty cheap. You can go online, you can get movies for free, you can get you can scroll on Instagram for free. You can go on YouTube and watch lots of free content. You can listen to podcasts. It's very easy to just access all types of entertainment. It's also easy to access productive things for learning and development, but you see what I'm saying here? It adds an extra emphasis on discipline that wasn't previously there, because by being disciplined now, you're able to use more resources. Like, you have access to more resources through your discipline. But lack of discipline, you are more easily distracted. Like, it requires an additional level of focus, you know. Whereas in the past, if you were distracted, you probably would get bored pretty easily because you didn't have access to so much entertainment, to so much, um, you know, so much cheap entertainment too. If you wanted to go do something and go to the movies or go to an arcade or whatever, you would have to spend money for all of that time. And then if you didn't do that, you would have to go to the library and look through the sections, and it would be harder to be productive. It was harder to be entertained. So everything's being accelerated by your choices at this point in time by technology. I think that's going to contribute also to a growing divide. Now, I don't think that's necessarily bad, okay? Like, I think people getting wealth for being productive and being disciplined is fine. But I think that it is going to create additional instability because people like to, I forget who said this, but someone said people will more readily uh, choose to hate others than to hate themselves or something. I don't know. I probably butchered that quote. I'll link it or quote it or put it in the description. But it's much easier to find a scapegoat and to demand policies. I think that's kind of what's going on with Mamdani in New York. I was reading a Wall Street Journal article, and they were talking about how there's a lot of graduates from universities that and they're trying to live in these urban areas, and they want access to that lifestyle, but they haven't necessarily gotten to that point yet. Maybe they haven't chosen the disciplined route of educating themselves in productive areas and productive sectors. Going to college and becoming educated aren't synonymous. It's very easy to go to college and not learn anything and just kind of go through the motions, or learn very little, or retain very little. And it's very easy to retain very little in an area that's not very useful. There's a lot of demand for certain fields, the professions, right? Like healthcare, engineering, these sorts of things. There's a lot of majors that are sort of part of the educational pyramid scheme where you have to go back into education. There's a limited number of spots in the professions. It's becoming increasingly competitive to go to medical school and these sorts of things. So socialism is appealing to those people. Of course, socialism is not really an adequate solution to these problems, right? This has been explored countless times. Price controls on groceries, government-run grocery stores. These sorts of things are not successful. I mean, you look just back at history and you can see that. But I'm not going to talk too much more right now. I'm just going to say that I'm just going to say those things, right? Money is becoming more abstract. It requires a higher barrier of entry to understand it, to keep up with it, to preserve wealth into the future. And because of that, that's going to contribute to growing class divide. On top of that, the amplification of your decisions. When you choose to be productive, it's easier to do that. And when you choose to procrastinate or to entertain yourself, it's also easier to do that. So you quickly go down, up or down. Everything's accelerated. So that's really the main emphasis of this video.